Good day, everyone. I am Aisa Bunsalagan, your third facilitator for today's asynchronous session. But this time, the topic that I will be discussing with you is the ethical considerations in conducting research. Now, before we proceed with the discussion, what do you think are the moral principles we need to observe in conducting research? As a pre-service teacher researcher, I will be dealing with the learners as my respondents. As a pre-service teacher researcher, I will be dealing with data that might contain personal information. As a pre-service teacher researcher, I will be dealing with previous studies owned by other individuals. And as a pre-service teacher researcher, I will be getting data that may cause unexpected results. With all this in my mind, what will I need to observe in dealing with these considerations? The answer to the question is knowing what research ethics are. According to Inago Academy, research ethics are the moral principles that researchers must follow in conducting research in their fields. Here are some ethical considerations that a researcher should know. First, we have ethical concerns in recruiting participants. Next is the disclosure of private data or information usage. We also have data falsification, fabrication, and plagiarism. The fourth one is the conflicts of interest. Lastly is the data retention and destruction. Now, let us go to the first ethical issue in recruiting our participants for the study. According to Scott Jones, the principles of autonomy, beneficence, and respect for persons are the guides for researchers to minimize the possible harm to participants while maximizing the benefits from the research. Where autonomy is where the researcher asks for consent information from the participants before conducting the study. Respect for persons includes treating the participants and colleagues fairly and taking precautions with vulnerable populations. So we will discuss the vulnerable populations in the following slides. And lastly, the principle of beneficence states that the welfare of the participants should always be the priority of the researchers. Informed consent and debriefing are part of the principle of autonomy. Now, what is informed consent? Informed consent is a process of communication where a participant gets to read and agree with the research procedures and that researchers in turn ensure their safety and well-being when conducting the research. The informed consent form should be an attachment in a research study, and debriefing is the final stage of the ongoing consent process, allowing the participants to discuss the research findings. Now, this will provide information on which to be removed for personal reasons or educational values. The second one is the use of deception. It is when the researchers do not fully inform the participants about the true objective and nature of their study because such action may affect the accuracy of the result. Deception is not ethical, so as a researcher, you must allow your participants to know the purpose of using such data. Another thing to be considered among our participants is to avoid them from harm, including the pain and suffering. Now, a researcher should ensure that no harm will come to participants, and this may be manifested through physical harm that includes psychological stress and feelings of having one's dignity, self-esteem, or self-efficacy compromised. Another one is the economic harm, where researchers impose the financial costs of the study on the participants. And lastly, we have social harm. So as a researcher, you should be aware of the negative effects of the study on your participants' interactions or leadership with others, including family members or friends. As a researcher, we also need to assess the risks and benefits for our study. Now, according to Fisher and Freiberg, researchers must consider the potential scientific and social value of their research and the magnitude of the benefits to participants. Let's go now to the vulnerable populations. A group of individuals requiring more protection against the potential risk of participating in research is the vulnerable population. Now, the following are the learners belong to basic education. Kindergarten pupils aged 5 years old, elementary pupils from 6 to 11 years old, junior high school learners from 12 to 15 years old, and lastly, senior high school learners who are commonly in the age range of 16 to 17 years old. Hence, these learners are considered minors or individuals under the legal age of consent. So if we're going to recruit them as our participants or respondents of the study, we need to secure first the assent form. And also, we need to be aware of Department Order Number 40, Series of 2012, or the DepEd Child Protection Policy. Aside from the minors, we also have minorities as part of the vulnerable population. We also have the trauma victims, or those who suffer from psychological and emotional distress. We also have individuals involved in a crisis like war and disaster, and economically disadvantaged individuals. We also need to consider the members of the LGBT community and the special education learners, including learners with disability. Now, all those mentioned groups are part of the vulnerable populations, and as researchers, we need to take precautionary measures in handling them. After knowing the ethical considerations in recruiting participants for our study, the next ethical consideration in conducting research is the disclosure of private data and information usage. Now, there are cases wherein we get sensitive information or personal data. So in that case, we should be aware of the Data Privacy Act of 2012. So, Data Privacy Act 2012 is an act that guarantees the free flow of information to promote innovation and growth while protecting the fundamental human right of privacy and communication. It is also an act that requires the consent of individuals before collecting all the personal data with declared, specified, and legitimate purpose of whom it may concern. So that ends my report. My fellow facilitator will continue the remaining ethical considerations in conducting research. So that's it. I hope you have learned something from me. Thank you and God bless.